Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to a very special occasion for a lecture this evening. We are extremely happy and privileged to have Professor Erik Brynjolfsson here with us in Oxford. He has spent the day in the city, in the university, also in a session that we organized today here at the Oxford Martin School with trade union leaders from the global trade union movement, talking about the future of work and technology. And I want to thank you, Erik, for having found time to meet with them also. Before I introduce our guest speaker and lecturer for this evening, let me just give you a couple of quick announcements. First of all, I want to thank the Oxford Internet Institute. This is a joint event hosted with them, and therefore, Erik, we are co-hosts of your lecture and event here this evening. The lecture and the question and answers are being live streamed and also filmed, so please be aware of that. There is a Q&A session after Professor Brynjolfsson's talk, and there will be a microphone, so please wait until the microphone reaches you before you ask your question or make your comment. And also, since we haven't started term yet, we have organized a little drinks reception afterwards, so you're all welcome to that. Let me briefly introduce our lecturer and guest speaker for this evening. Professor Brynjolfsson will speak this evening about the second wave of the second machine age. And this may not surprise some of you because his bestseller, that has in many ways reached all corners of the world, The Second Machine Age, Work, Progress and Prosperity in a Time of Brilliant Technologies, has actually been one of the big books, if I may put it in those terms, of the past few years on what is happening around us and what is happening with technology and what that may mean for all of us in the years to come. I also want to direct you, if you are interested, and certainly make you aware of that, his next book, Machine, Platform, Crowd, will be published this June, but if you're interested, already available on Amazon.com. As a pre-order. So if you want to help bring some attention to what you will hear about this evening to the world and alert them to this new book, then you're obviously welcome to do so. Erik Brynjolfsson is the director of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology Initiative on the Digital Economy and the Schussel Family Professor at the MIT Sloan School. His research examines the effects of information technologies on business strategy, productivity and performance, digital commerce, and intangible assets. At MIT, he teaches courses on the economics of information and within the analytics lab. Professor Brynjolfsson was amongst the first researchers to measure the productivity contributions of IT and the complementary role of organizational capital and other intangibles. He asked me not to spend too much time introducing him because he has far too much to tell you himself, so it is a great honor and pleasure to welcome you, Erik. Welcome to the Oxford Martin School and the Oxford Internet Institute.
Thank you, Akeem. It is such a pleasure to be here, and I'm very grateful for that introduction. And I'm looking forward to interacting with all of you. As Akeem mentioned, I have some slides. I want to share with you some of the research we've been doing at MIT, but I'm actually quite interested in having a conversation and hearing a bit about what you're observing and learning a bit about some of the challenges and opportunities you're seeing and hearing what questions you have about the work that we've been doing. My view is that we're in the early stages of a tremendous revolution in the economy and society that's driven by some big changes in technology. Some of those we described, Andrew McAfee and I described in our earlier book, The Second Machine Age, and they trace to some of the changes in codifying knowledge that I'll explain in a little while. But the past few years we've been seeing, I think, an even more profound transformation, which is based on the power of machines that can learn, machine learning. And this has some new implications that go beyond anything we discussed in the book. And I want to share with you some of the things that we're seeing and get your reaction to maybe some of the industries and occupations and ways the economy will change going forward. I'll show you some, but I think this is something we can all think about together. So before I dive into that, let me just get a sense from you. How many people here would like to have the power to change the world? Just being able to have the power to change the world, okay. All right, most of you, I see, okay. So what does it take to change the world? I mean, many people have come up with opinions on that. It's been famously said that what it takes is a small group of highly committed people, like we have in this room here, or an insanely great vision. But I'm going to give you a kind of a different perspective, more of an engineering perspective, an MIT perspective, kind of a boring perspective perhaps, which is that what it takes to change the world is two things: a power system and a control system. A power system is what's required to literally move around things in the world. If you want to change the world, you need to physically change the atoms in the world. We're mostly made of atoms, and most of the world is, and they're held in place by powerful physical forces. So you need a power system to be able to do that. You need to transform the world, otherwise it'll be the same as what it was before. But you also need a control system. A control system tells you where and how to arrange those atoms, how to organize what you do with the power system. So those are the fundamentals, and you're thinking, where's he going with this? This is kind of a little weird here. But what I want to make the case for is that for most of human history, we were the power system and the control system in order to do things. Our physical bodies and brains were what did that. But things changed a couple hundred years ago, actually starting mostly here in England with James Watts's far better steam engine, and later other technologies like the internal combustion engine and electricity. These are what economists call general purpose technologies, and these powerful technologies massively amplified the power system that we had at our disposal. They gave us much more physical power to rearrange the world in gross ways and increasingly fine-grained ways. I see Eric Drexler here, and so it's all the way going down to the atomic level at some point. So that change of allowing us to augment human and animal muscle power with technology led to a huge change in our living standards and the way life progressed. Today we are about 30 times richer than our ancestors in the 1700s, mostly because of this improvement in the power system. And it continues to improve. Call that the Industrial Revolution. I believe we're now in relatively early stages of a second machine age, focused not on amplifying the power system, but on the control system. Not our muscles, but our brains. Or maybe I should say not just our muscles, because it also continues. And there's a set of powerful general purpose technologies there: computers, software, increasingly machine intelligence. In some ways, this is similar to the other revolution. It's giving us vastly more power to augment ourselves and affect the universe in ways we never could have before. But there are also some potential differences. The Industrial Revolution, the machines were mostly a complement to humans. Complement, two things are more valuable when they're complements together. A substitute is when something replaces the other component and makes it less valuable. How do I know that machines were mostly a complement? Well, one easy way is to measure what is the economic value of an hour of labor. The wages kept going up for most of the past 200 years. People were willing to pay more for a laborer with a power shovel than a laborer with an ordinary shovel. And the more technology people had at their disposal, it made them more valuable economically, by and large. There were exceptions and went in different ways, but the broad spread of things was rising wages for a couple of hundred years. Today, it's not so obvious that's happening. As we write in the book, median wages in the United States and other advanced countries in the OECD have stagnated for the past 20 years or so, since the late 1990s. They've been bouncing around a little bit, but haven't really grown anymore. And there are a number of reasons for this, but the economic consensus increasingly is that the way that technology is being used is increasingly not helping 50% or more of the population, maybe 80% of the population. The machines are increasingly a substitute for many of the kinds of labor that are important in the economy, and as a result, while the pie is getting bigger, as I'll show you, it's not being distributed as evenly as it used to, and this increased inequality is affecting a lot of people, in part because some of these technologies can replace what was done before. If you think about it, when you introduce a steam locomotive or automate or add machinery to a factory, you still need the control system, and that was the humans. But if you have machines doing both components of that, then there's less scope for what humans are going to add to the equation. And that's part of why it may not be as much of a complement as it once was. Now, if you look at the broader scope of things, though, we have had some really good progress. And one way to measure that is a curve like this, which goes back to 8,000 BC. You could take it back further if you want. And you could call this the curve of human history. And back here, Watt's steam engine really essentially bent the curve of human history. I'm here in Britain and walking around Oxford, you see a lot of amazing history with kings and emperors and wars and plagues, and before that, invention of philosophical concepts and Pythagoras' theorem. All of that didn't really make a dent in basic living standards. Great to read about, but when things really started changing for the average common person, the reason that our daily lives are so different from somebody in 1700 or 1600 or 1500 or 2000 BC is because these technologies. I'm at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, so I may be a little biased, but I'm sure there are other things that happened as well. But I think this is one of the key turning points was our ability to use these technologies. And that's why I think it's so important that we're now in these, entering this second machine age, because to preview some of my conclusions a bit, I can't see how this ability to augment our brains and to address the control system isn't going to be at least as important, and isn't already at least as important as the first machine age and what it did for our muscles. In a way, it's a broader scope of things. So let me further break down the machine age, the second machine age, into two parts, the first wave and the second wave. And most of my talk is going to be about the second wave, but to lay the groundwork, let me do one or two slides on the first wave of the second machine age. This is the automating and augmenting of human power. So the first wave is really about teaching machines what we knew, taking our knowledge and putting it into machines. Really, when you think about what coders do, all those people who are making a lot of money in different companies, tech companies, but also regular companies, coding means codifying knowledge, taking what you know about how tax preparation works and writing down in excruciating detail exactly which number gets added to which other number when you divide it. And we all know if you put a comma in the wrong place, the whole thing could run awry. It doesn't work. You have to be very, very specific about how you codify that knowledge. It's been a huge, huge win. It's a multi-trillion-dollar industry, created enormous wealth for the economy by some simple things like arithmetic and simple logic to more and more complex things. And there's been a mantra that's made Bill Gates and many other people very, very wealthy, and that is that you codify, then you digitize, then you replicate. If you can take a task, figure out exactly how it works, and codify that very explicitly, once you've got the code, you then digitize it into zeros and ones, and once you've got it as 0 and 1s, then you can make a copy of it. Then you can make 10 copies of it. Then you can make 100 million copies of it. And each of those copies has almost zero marginal cost. Each of them can be transmitted anywhere on the planet almost instantaneously. Each of those copies is a perfect replica of the original, so it's a machine that can make perfect copies. So free, instant, perfect, those are three adjectives that we didn't just use to describe most things before the digital era, but they're standard for digital goods. And they allow you to take a piece of codified knowledge and multiply its value by 100 million-fold or a billion-fold, and that adds up to a lot, and why we see so many more billionaires now than we did 10 or 20 years ago, largely because of the different ways of amplifying this, not just software, but built into our financial system and other kinds of industries. High fixed costs and low marginal costs, as I was just saying, and there's lots of sort of standard things. You know, these are trillion-dollar opportunities here. Enterprise resource planning, customer relationship management, supply chain systems, mobile apps, etc. So that's been the first machine age. Has created a tremendous amount of wealth. This quote from Freeman Dyson comments, and some of it isn't even measured. Someone sent me this newspaper ad from the early 1990s of all sorts of objects, and they pointed out that pretty much everything in this ad is now bundled for free in here. You know, there's the the music player. Oh, this one's a lot better than that one. There's the video, the camera and the video camera, an alarm clock, a calculator, an answering machine, if anybody guys remembers what that was. So all sorts of objects, a computer, of course, except this one is much more powerful. So that's all, most of those apps are now free in here, and they don't really show up in our GDP statistics, but they're really quite valuable. And there's many things that we never even had before that are also for free, like turn-by-turn driving directions I used to get here this morning that used to cost, well, you had to be in the military and spend hundreds of millions of dollars to have access to that technology, and now there are half a dozen driving apps that I have on my phone. So that's good news, the bounty that's been created. But there are limits to this, and my friend and colleague David Otter at MIT has been particularly clear in pointing out the limits, that in order to codify all that knowledge and take advantage of the first machine age, we need to understand the problem well enough. It doesn't work for tacit knowledge. Or as Michael Polanyi said very eloquently, we all know more than we can tell. I know how to recognize my mother's face, but I have a hard time writing down the code of the shape of her eyes or her eyebrows or ears or whatever. It would be very hard for me to express that. Or, any of us, we can recognize lots of faces when we couldn't codify, or riding a bicycle, or just walking up the stairs. There are so many tasks that we have today, so many skills that we have today that it's just very hard for us to express in words. It's tacit knowledge. And why is this important? Well, if we can't express it, if we can't take it from tacit to explicit, how could we ever teach a machine to do it? We can't even explain it to each other. And David Otter wrote a nice piece I guess it's almost 2 years ago now, about why are there so many jobs, and the essence of his argument was that, sure, we can codify our existing knowledge, but our tacit knowledge remains beyond the hope of machines, and therefore there will be scope for things that only humans can do, and machines simply can't figure out. So recognizing faces was one of the examples. As Michael Polanyi mentioned. But now we have machines that recognize faces. Most of you probably have a Facebook account, and you know that it will go ahead and label, if you want it to, the faces of your friends and your family in there. It recognizes who they are. So it does that quite well. And progress recently at Microsoft and elsewhere at Google has gotten to the point where it can even, in many cases, recognize faces better than we humans can. And this has been a real breakthrough, a real transition, mostly just in the past 5 years where it became very powerful, where machines, contrary to David Otter's point, actually are able to recognize faces and are able to do a lot of tacit knowledge. And David also, I should be clear, he's recognizing this point and is updating some of what he's written. This is part of the second machine wave, second wave of the second machine age, not just codifying knowledge, but now machines that learn on their own. They learn from examples, and they figure out the rules. We don't have to tell it how to make those decisions. Machines decide on their own how to make the distinctions between two different faces, or how to walk upstairs or do other basic tasks. And it's a branch of artificial intelligence, and in particular, the deep learning category has been one of the most effective areas, and let me just show you a little bit more about that. It's something that can be used in supervised learning systems where you basically give it many examples and you tag the data and say, for instance, in this case, these have cancer, these are not cancer. If you show it enough examples, it starts noticing the patterns in there. And systems such as this one have not only recognized the dozen or so markers for cancer that are described in pathology textbooks by humans that we teach our humans to recognize, but it identified several new ones that had never been written about in the pathology network. So it's finding other patterns that are important. And if you think about it, this is actually not different from the face recognition system in ways. You could show it faces. This is a picture of my mother. This is not a picture of my mother, and eventually it will learn to recognize those differences. And not only can machines do this kind of tag data, and with supervised learning, you have to have some examples, but they also can learn dynamically over time how to solve different kinds of problems. And there's a great example of this that the Google DeepMind team put together of playing Atari video games. It's a nice domain where you have fairly structured understanding of what the score is and how to do better. So they gave about 36 Atari video games to a network that they had trained to analyze them. And they didn't tell the network what the rules were. They wouldn't say, here's a strategy for winning or losing in Space Invaders or Pac-Man or Breakout. They just said, here are the pixels. Here are the raw pixels, ... data coming in. Here's the score. We'll start it at 0. And here's a controller. You can wiggle it around. Go. And then they sent it the data, and the machine started wiggling it around and started learning over time. And this video works. You can see one game, which is Breakout. Some of you may have played this in your childhood. So you hit the little paddle. I don't know why it's not sure. There it is. And at first, it's sort of random. You know, it sort of sometimes hits it. It gets lucky. It misses a lot. After 300 games, it's beginning to sort of learn, okay, I want to move this joystick to get that paddle in front. It doesn't know what a paddle is yet, but it's sort of figuring out, and it's sort of jerking around a little bit. But you can see most of the time it's hitting. It's probably better than most humans at this point. It keeps playing a bit, and then unexpectedly, the DeepMind people were very surprised to see it did this. It figured out this new strategy. It's like, oh, I don't need to hit it all the time. I'm just going to send it up there, and the ball will just get a lot of points for me automatically. And I talked to the guys who developed this system, and they claimed that none of the developers were aware of that particular strategy, that it was just something that the machine learned on its own. So it learned to go from 0 knowledge to being roughly human to learning things that even the humans hadn't thought to do by exploring the space of possibilities. And this same basic reinforcement learning approach, it's called reinforcement learning in this case, was a combination, but mainly reinforcement learning. They took it and they applied it to these other games, and of the 30 or so different games, about half of them it was able to play well. Mike, do you happen to know the exact number that they got and didn't? Okay, so it's in this article in Nature, and about half of the games in Atari, it was able to play successfully at human level performance, or in some cases, superhuman performance, and about half of them not so much. And trying to understand where it works well and doesn't work well is an important question, but it seems that when you have a quick feedback loop, if you are able to very quickly say, yeah, that's successful, that's not successful. Here, the feedback was pretty quick. You get points as soon as you hit the thing, and you lose points as soon as you miss. It can learn very effectively. Space Invaders, shoot the aliens, you can learn that very quickly. Games that took more thinking, like Pac-Man, I don't want to have this whole be a lecture on video games, but Pac-Man, you know, if you want to go to the upper left corner, maybe first it's a maze. So maybe you have to understand that you first have to go down and to the right. So it's not quite such a quick feedback. You need to sort of do a little bit of planning and thinking ahead. It didn't do so well on that game, although after they published the article, they did go ahead and add some enhancements, and it was able to learn that. And then some games that are just very, very long-term planning oriented. There's a game called Montezuma's Revenge, where you design a whole world and you get to play, and you don't really find out until the end how it turned out. It just had no idea what to do with that. They couldn't make any progress on that. So there's some patterns of what works well and what doesn't work well, but the key point is that you can learn, machines can learn how to solve many, many kinds of tasks. I showed you pixels, but one of the founders showed me that you could also apply this, take a video camera and have a robot arm catching a ball. And now you have a physical robot arm, and it will learn, hey, if I move the arm in just the right way, I will be able to learn this simple task. I could learn how to pick up an object, and it would be the same basic underlying technology of reinforcement learning that's teaching it how to do tasks that we don't know quite what the rules are, how to catch a baseball or a cricket ball, whatever country you're in. You have to sort of get some kind of feedback. So that's, let's see if this works here. So that's how it's progressed, and there have been a number of amazing applications that I want to lay out, and then we'll talk about some of the economic implications of it. Let me put them into 3 categories, because each of these 3 categories, interacting with the physical world, language, and problem solving, I would say 10 or 15 years ago, you would have been safe saying that these are things that only humans can do, and that's no longer the case. And that's why I think this is revolutionary. And all 3 of them, there have been dramatic progress, which I'll show you quickly here. if you come to MIT, I invite you. It's a welcome, friendly place, but you may run into this robot cheetah that one of my colleagues has developed, Jabu King. And this can run about 28 miles per hour, so you will not be able to outrun it. I don't think anyone in this room could outrun it. And I remember one time I was at the athletics center, and this cheetah was running laps. And just to make it more interesting, they were throwing objects, chairs and things in front of it, and it was timing its leap to leap over them as it went around. So it was pretty intelligent. And again, this is from, you didn't program in, okay, if you see a chair, do this. It learned on its own how to adjust the patterns. There's, of course, wheeled robots. Another colleague of mine, Danielle Roos and her team, have a set of robot taxis that are now in operation in Singapore. I think it was the first place to have a robot taxi fleet. I'm sure we'll see many more soon. Uber and others are working on it. These are sort of not full-blown cars. They're kind of halfway between a car and a golf cart. They drive pretty slow. I think they max out at 25 miles per hour. The idea being if they do somehow make an accident, it hasn't happened yet, but it would be less likely to be really serious that way. And the other thing is that it's within a constrained part of Singapore. So they don't roam everywhere, but there's a cordoned off area of Singapore. I have a friend who's there right now, and he's going to give me a report back tomorrow about what he sees there. But within that constrained area, they have mapped it very intensively, and they know exactly what to look for. There are pedestrians and bicyclists and other things, skateboards, that are wandering around, but it detects them and safely navigates. More and more robots are working in factories. Rod Brooks, who used to be the head of the Computer Science and AI Lab, has a company called Rethink Robotics, and they make robots like this. This is Baxter. He was nice enough. I have one of these in my office at MIT. I haven't quite figured out what useful tasks it can do for me. I was thinking maybe grade papers, but many factories have found them very useful because there are millions of people, including thousands of people in Massachusetts, that have jobs like this robot. They basically take things off an assembly line and they have to put them in boxes, and they do that all day long. And it's kind of a boring, repetitive task, but until recently, it was hard to teach robots how to recognize these different things in a somewhat random way. And since the tasks changed, you had to reprogram them. Baxter can be reprogrammed just by, you show it physically. You don't have to write code. You gently grab his arm, you push this little button over here, this little button, and then you can kind of guide Baxter's arm and show it what to pick up and what to drop. And then after that, it will learn, okay, I get it. I'm supposed to pick up objects like this and put it into the box over here. And it figures that out, and then you can get to work. Baxter costs about $20,000, $25,000. Rod Brooks says that the operating cost works out to be about $4 per hour. So if I was a human worker doing that task, I would not want to compete with Baxter. And there's a new generation of Baxter called Sawyer coming out that's twice as fast, much more nimble, much more efficient. And of course, with Moore's law, you'll keep having progress like that. These machines will keep getting better and better and faster. And for the set of tasks that it can do, it's very, very competitive. Of course, not all tasks, but those tasks very well. So that's robotics, and there's a huge explosion. Those of you who have visited China may have seen factories like this. It was fascinating for me to go and see 4,000 people in one factory all working side by side in these tasks. And in many ways, they are in the bullseye, as I was saying to Hakeem earlier, of the robot revolution, because those are very much the kinds of tasks that can be automated going forward. We also had huge improvements in vision. A team at Stanford put together an amazing database of a few million images. They call ImageNet. And the nice thing about these pictures isn't it just the random pictures, but they had some humans take the time to label what they are. This is a dog, this is a cat, this is a penguin. This is the flipper of a whale shark. Some of them are kind of hard to identify. Others are much easier. Humans are pretty good at it. Most things they can recognize on this database, humans get about 95% accuracy. Some of them, like that flipper of the whale shark, I don't know. I might not recognize that. Machines used to be much worse. As recently as 2010, they got a third of them wrong. But you can see they very rapidly have improved, and it's cut off here, but they're now down below 5% in terms of accuracy, which is about the human level, and in many kinds of tasks better than human level. Blaise Iguera-Arca at Google showed me a little app on his phone. He's a researcher in this area, that you pointed at a bird, and it will not only say, oh, that's a bird, it will say the exact species of bird, the gender of the bird, and everything. So it knows far more than I do about all the different kinds of birds that you might see out in nature. So they've gotten much, much better. And that's running on a phone. And this opens up opportunities in things like cars. Mobileye has a technology that they're making available to car makers, well, selling for money. When they first started it, it got about 1 out of every 30 frames of video incorrectly labeled. Well, 30 frames, that's about 1 per second. It was getting wrong, so you wouldn't want that. Now it's down to, I hope I get this number right, 1 in 30 million, but it works out to decades that it would run without mislabeling, cars and bicycles. So it's improved quite dramatically. My friend Jeremy Howard has a company called Analytic, and they're doing what I showed you earlier with the diagnosing of medical images, using medical images to diagnose diseases. It's a great problem for deep learning and machine learning applications, and will undoubtedly save many, many lives going forward. And right on cue, we have better than human face recognition coming up. The second application I want to mention is in language, and many of you have some experiences with this. That has also gone through a big revolution, where it used to be people would very painstakingly figure out the syntax of every sentence and exactly map it, and they would have language linguists, explain that. Now, the best systems have given up on, or have stopped using that sort of very structured approach. What they simply do is they feed in all the raw waveforms, the sound waves, from language being spoken, and they have a training set that says, here are the words that are being said, and then the system learns how to match those raw waveforms to particular words. And by running this on large enough data sets, you get essentially human or even superhuman levels of speech recognition. And it's just happening the past few months that this is getting quite powerful. So Microsoft has one that is at human level performance, even in a conversation with multiple people speaking and interacting and interrupting one another, something that you couldn't do before. And some of you may have interactions with Siri or Google Now or Echo, and you get the sense that they're not perfect, but they're getting better and better, good enough for sort of basic conversation. More and more, when I'm writing emails and text now, I just dictate them, and most of the time it's right. But I think you can try yourself, and you can see exactly where we are on that frontier. Tom Mitchell at Carnegie Mellon says that us in this room and on the planet today are in the middle of about a 10-year period where we went from machines basically not understanding humans to machines understanding humans pretty well. And we're just kind of transitioning through that. That's a big milestone when you think about it in human history, being able to talk to machines and have them understand what we're saying. They can also translate once they understand us. So Akeem's going to be spending some time at the UN again, and they have a lot of human translators, which has provided a lot of the tag data for these learning systems. But now if you use Skype, many of you probably use Skype, you can communicate with people in other countries. I wouldn't negotiate a $10 million deal that way with someone else, but for basic, easy, conversation, getting the gist of it, it's amazing. You can speak in, and there are a number of startups that have these fun little earpieces you can put in your ear, and as you walk around in China or France or America, when they're speaking some language that you don't understand, that'll translate it with just a couple second delay what the other person is saying to you, kind of science fiction-y. And they're even generating text as well. Companies like Narrative Science and Automated Insights are a couple of companies that are generating lots of text. And just, you may not realize how widespread this is, but when you look at sports scores of your favorite football team or cricket team or baseball team, you'll find that many of the little short stories about what happened in the last game are actually generated by one of these automated machines. They take the box score of what happened and they turn it into text. Or earnings reports. All those companies that come out every quarter with earnings reports, they will generate a 2 or 3 paragraph story about what was surprising, what wasn't surprising, what the earnings were, all written by machines. I wouldn't try and depend on it for a really long, complicated analysis, but for basic, simple stories, they can do it. Here's one of those stories generated by Automated Insights about earnings reports. And then the last one I want to mention is perhaps the most profound one before we get into some of the economic implications is problem solving. Solving not just structured but unstructured questions and pattern recognition. So one of the famous examples of that was AlphaGo beating the ancient game of Go by the team here nearby in London, Demis Hassabis and company. And Go is interesting because this is a game that has a very high branching factor. As you may have heard, you can put stones in any of these different places, and that creates a lot of different options at each point. It branches far more rapidly than, say, chess or tic-tac-toe. There's only, 9 places you can go initially and 8 after that. And chess, there's also a fairly limited number, I think about 32 moves at any level. But this one has far more possible moves, and as a result, there are more possible games of Go than there are atoms in the universe, for instance. So it's just an unimaginably large number. And what that means is that sort of a traditional brute force, hey, let's just test all the possibilities, would never work. You wouldn't make any progress. The other thing that's interesting about Go, which I think is related, is that no human knows how they play the game of Go. Now, that may sound kind of strange because obviously they play it, but they don't know how they're playing it. It's a classic example of tacit knowledge. You interview the Go players and you say, why did you go there? Why did you put your stone in that particular place? And they'll say, well, it just felt like the right thing to do. And that, it just seemed like this would be stronger. And they're like, well, but why? And they're just, well, I can't express it. They literally are unable to explain. There's a few sort of heuristics and strategic rules, but by and large, it's more of a game of intuition and pattern recognition. Because there are so many possible Go moves, well, I should not leave out the punchline, as you probably guessed, and you may have heard, machines can now play Go better than humans. So the best Go player as of last year is AlphaGo, which is a machine that beat the best humans. And the human champions are looking at it, and when they see the way that AlphaGo plays, they realize that they have barely scratched the surface of what's possible. AlphaGo is using some strategies and techniques that they just hadn't thought of. And if I had a longer talk, I would go and show you some of the surprising moves that AlphaGo did in some of their championship games that all the regular Go players, the very good Go players, thought you would never want to do that, but it turned out to be a very good strategy. And Keijo basically said that no human has even touched the edge of the truth of Go. There's just so many possibilities. AlphaGo is making rapid progress on that, a lot of room. But there's some more practical applications of more or less related technologies, again by DeepMind. And a great one I really like is what they did with their energy centers. They used a lot of energy actually to win the game of Go with AlphaGo. They put a lot of processing power to calculating the optimal strategy. And as a way of giving back, they decided to turn those algorithms on the data centers themselves. And as you probably know, these are hugely expensive operations. Companies like Google, they won't say how much they spend on it, but they're so important that they will often locate their data centers next to a hydroelectric dam because it needs to get cheap electricity and needs to be located in a place where they can get power. That's how much energy consumption there is. These data centers, they put some of their smartest operations research, mathematicians, operations guys on it to try to optimize it because they don't want to waste electricity. The team at DeepMind said, hey, let's see if we can do better. And they faced some skepticism. They said, look, we've already optimized this data center. There's no more room. There's no more juice to be squeezed from this orange. It's already running completely optimally. But the DeepMind said, well, just give us the data and we'll see what we can do. And if you think about it, it's like a giant video game, isn't it? It's got all these dials that you can adjust in the data center. You've got a score of what your efficiency is, and you can try to adjust it, with the constraint that you have to keep the computers running. Can you save electricity by adjusting thousands of parameters? And if you do a good job, you get the score of better efficiency. So they did that, and after a few months, these deep learning nets were able to come up, and with a reinforcement system, able to come up with a much better power utilization. So when the humans were running it, the utilization was fairly high. Do we have the numbers here? I guess not in this one. But you can see there's a tremendous drop. It turned out to be a drop of about 40% in energy efficiency. It was just staggering. 15% in overall reduction, 40% of the energy part. And then they turned it off again and said, okay, humans, you guys take over again, see what you've learned. And it more or less went back to the old level of efficiency. So this system was able to run this kind of operation much, much more efficiently. Think about how important this is, not just for data centers, but for any factory, any operation in the world where you have that kind of data about how you're performing. You can now feed it into a deep learning system, a reinforcement learning system, and it can learn how to run more efficiently. It works not just with complete information, but also what game theorists call games of incomplete information, like poker. If you're playing the card game poker, you don't exactly know what the other player has and whether they're bluffing or telling the truth when they make their bids and their declares. So you have to make inferences about things that you can't see. And again, until very recently, only humans could do this successfully. The machine poker players were always crushed by the human players, partly because of bluffing and incomplete information. Not true anymore. Once again, the date there, just a few months ago, machines can now do this better too. And that's also important because there's so many tasks in our lives that depend on incomplete information going forward. I was down at JP Morgan talking to the guys, the bankers there, and they told me about a system that now does in seconds what they used to have a staff spend literally hundreds of thousands of hours going through legal decisions and legal documents. There's a system that's helping to treat diabetes, coming up with a better algorithm for it. And here's one of my favorites. We write about it in our new book, Machine Platform Crowd, which, as Akeem mentioned, is available at Amazon. This one sorts cucumbers. There was a guy who, his mother grew cucumbers, and one of the things, I think I have 16 grades of cucumbers in Japan, and she had to sort them into the different categories. He said, well, this seems like a job for machine learning. We can look at them and put them into each of those categories based on their color, shape, etc. And what I like about this particular one, this was not a team from some high-powered university or big tech company. This was somebody using off-the-shelf software. You can get software like TensorFlow on the web for free. And if you have the data, you can enter it in, and you can learn. You just have to tag it and say, this is a grade A cucumber, and this is a grade B cucumber. And over time, it will learn how to classify them going forward if you give it enough data. And last but not least, the example I'll give is machines that can gauge your potential for work. So they can decide where we humans should be working. And I'm advising a company called NAC that does exactly that. So what does this mean for business and the economy? And let me talk a little bit about that, and then I want to get some questions and comments from all of you as well. Well, the good news is that it is making the pie bigger. I showed you some of the advances in health and education, all the energy consumption, good for the environment. But I want to stress another point, which is that there's no economic law that everybody will benefit. It's possible for some people to be left behind. In fact, according to all the economic textbooks and the theory, if you look at it carefully, it's possible for a majority of people to be left behind. You could have this growing pie all go to 1% or less of the population. And to some extent, we've been having that pattern going forward. Most of history, it wasn't that way. Most of the past 200 years, it was a rising tide that lifted most boats. But there's nothing in economics that says it has to go that way. And the data are that there's been a troubling divergence. Andrew McAfee and I call this the great decoupling. Let's just look at the top couple of lines. Productivity continues to grow, not as much in Britain, but it's still, by and large, not falling, at least. In the United States, it's been going up some. And GDP's been going up. But median family income, these are US data, as I mentioned earlier, is basically stagnated since the late 2000s or year 2000. Actually, it's gone up a little bit here, but it's still below its peak. So there's a bigger and bigger gap. We call that the great decoupling. These used to be tightly linked, rise together, and increasingly they are diverging. How is that possible? Well, the pie is becoming more unevenly distributed going forward. And we talked about this in our earlier book, Race Against the Machine. The technological advances are leading to all sorts of biases going forward. David Otter, who I mentioned earlier, and David Dorn talked about how computers are substituting for these middle skill tasks. I mentioned that earlier, bookkeeping, clerical work, and that's leading to a fall in the demand for those. And now there's really just a growing chorus. Just the past year or so, I co-chaired a report from the National Academy of Sciences, and a group of experts weighed in and said that technology is a big part of what's leading to this wage inequality. Here's a paper by Doron Acemoglu, who recently just came out with a paper. This is literally April of 2017, that robots were replacing a lot of employment and also reducing wages for those workers going forward. And there are many other people. I won't read them all for you, and there's a big literature that economists are coming around to the view that technology is a big part of what's driving this great decoupling and this divergence. And my view is it's going to get even bigger in the next 10 years because of some of the change, or at least the disruption potential is bigger. It's going to depend a lot on what our choices are. How is this possible? And let me just give you a little bit of economics here, and then we'll get to the questions. And that is because of the concept of biased technical change. In particular, technology can just make everything better, make it better for everybody, or it can be biased in a way that helps some groups and hurts other groups. And let me give you 3 examples of biased technical change that are very important in the economy today. The first one is skill-biased technical change that affects high-skilled workers differently than low and medium-skilled workers. So you may be able to easily automate a lot of low-skilled tasks. Some of you may see these kind of kiosks where you can order things. It's like an ATM, but for lots of other things. And the data are getting quite striking. You see that in the early part of the century, all the different skill groups were getting better. Whether you were at graduate school or high school, everybody's wages were going up. Even if you're a high school dropout, those are good days. Then the oil shock, a lot of people, pretty much everyone took a bit of a hit. But since then, it's kind of fanned out. And today, people who are going to graduate school or college in America have done better, but people without as much education have done worse. This is for male workers, because I didn't want to confound it with the entry of women into the labor force, but the same thing is true for female workers. The whole thing is skewed upward a little bit, but there's also been this fanning out of wages over time. So people with less education are not benefiting from the growth in the economy. It's not surprising that a lot of them are upset and unhappy with the way things are going. Middle skill workers have been especially hard hit. If you look at the 2 extremes in wages, for instance, in America, people who are at the top of the wage distribution or people near the bottom have done relatively well. People sort of the middle and lower side are the ones who have been hurt the most. These are some of the professionals, CEOs, sports stars. The middle income people are, middle skilled people are, the bookkeepers, tax accountants, clerical work that I mentioned, some of the factory workers. And the very low end, interestingly, those are things, some of the day laborers, gardeners, janitors, and those jobs have not been very automated. They involve some physical dexterity that so far machines haven't been able to do, although that may change going forward. The second kind of bicycle change is capital versus labor. An old change. Travis Kalanick, the CEO of Uber, has been working very hard on making self-driving cars. And one of the reasons, it's not rocket science, he realized, hey, if we could take the labor out of that, then the whole thing would be a lot cheaper. So that's good news for the customers. They could have cars with a lot less cost. It's good news for Travis and his stockholders. They can become much wealthier. It's not so good news for the people who used to be driving the cars. They need to find something else because their old job isn't going to be there anymore. So it's another example of more of the value going to capital and less of the value going to labor in that case. And we've seen this happen in the data as well. Focus on the blue line here. It kind of bounces around a little bit, but this is the share of GDP, the share of all of our income in the economy that goes to workers. And while it moved around depending on the recession or whatever, lately it's only been going pretty much in one direction, which is downward. And it's at a record low, not just in the United States, but in countries around the world. It's a widespread pattern that the share of GDP going to labor is shrinking over time. And there are many forces at work again here, but part of it is the substitution of capital for labor. And the last one I'll talk about is what I'd call superstar bias technical change. And Michael Spence and Andy McAfee and I wrote about this in an article in Foreign Affairs a little while ago. But there are some people, whether they have singing ability or they've written a great app. This is Scott Cook, who wrote TurboTax. And they've figured out how to take something that's codifiable, whether it's music or art or software, codify it and then replicate it, like I said earlier, replicate it to tens or hundreds of millions of people. As a result, Scott Cook is a billionaire. And who's that? Lady Gaga is also doing pretty well. But other people, the tax preparers who used to do that work, they're not in demand anymore. And this has led, you could call this skill bias technical change, but it's really very, very concentrated. It's really not just the top college graduates or the top 1%. It turns out the 1% have their own 1%. This is the 0.01%. There we go, 0.01%. So this is the 1% of the 1%. And they have done extraordinarily well, and the income that is now going to the 0.01% is at a record high. The only time it was equally high was just before the Great Depression, if that's any comfort. Again, there are a number of forces at work here in tax policy, social norms, but I think a big part of it, and more research is needed, is the ability of people to take an idea and once they codify it, replicate it. And that leads to extraordinary returns to that 1%, to superstars who are able to do that. It leads increasingly to winner-take-all markets. There's not need for 100,000 different tax preparation programs. All you need is one or a few, and then you can do it. Actually, you guys may not even need that because I think taxes are a lot easier to prepare in Britain, but in America it's a big chore. So I want to wrap up by just asking a couple of broad questions, and then we'll get into some of the discussion. I think we have about half an hour for that. So are we witnessing the end of labor? A lot of people say, hey, this means that robots can do everything. No, I don't think that's the answer. I think that there's so much work today that only humans can do, and I think that will be true for the next 10, 20, 30 years, maybe longer. I spent a lot of time talking to experts in artificial intelligence and machine learning, and they almost all agree that there are many things that machines are very bad at. I even showed you some of the video games that machines can do well and some they can't do well. But there are a lot of physical tasks. I think interpersonal and social tasks are especially important. Most of us wouldn't get the same experience interacting, face-to-face with a human versus a machine for coaching or motivation or teaching, nursing, healthcare. There are a lot of creative tasks. Machines aren't able to formulate problems very well. They can't do the long-term planning. They can do sort of short-term creativity, but not long-term creativity. Now, perhaps most importantly, figuring out how to frame a problem. Pablo Picasso once famously said, computers are useless. All they do is give you answers. And he has a point there that actually perhaps the most important thing is asking the right questions. It's nice if you also have somebody or something that can help answer them. But I think more and more of what humans will be doing is framing the problems, asking where do we want to aim all this computer power at to solve questions. And entrepreneurship is often a bundle of many of these kinds of things put together, and humans are still the best entrepreneurs and will need more of those. So there are many kinds of tasks. Some of them require lots of creativity and high IQ. Some of them require more emotional intelligence or physical skills. And there'd be a mix of different kinds of skills needed going forward. But I don't think that we are out of jobs or problems that need to be solved on this planet. There are many things that we need humans for. And so I think the calls or the fear of that there's nothing left for humans to do is way, way premature and in some ways counterproductive. But we can talk about that more if you'd like. My view is that what's going on really is that these digital technologies are changing quite rapidly, but our organizations and our skills, our policies, our government are not keeping up. And that's the mismatch, this racing ahead of machines, and we're not adjusting fast enough. We don't have the right skills, we don't have the right policies, and that means that we're having a mismatch and leaving many people behind. So the challenge going forward is to fix that. There was a famous DARPA grand challenge about a decade ago to make a self-driving car, and that motivated technologists, and the result has been we have some pretty decent self-driving cars getting better and better. At the time, people thought it was an impossible goal. Now, I think we need a new grand challenge, not simply to make new technologies, but to think about ways of using those technologies to create more broadly shared prosperity. We need to focus on inventing better skills, better organizations, better institutions. And if we do that, I think we can have not just a bigger pie, but also one where we have more broadly shared prosperity. So let me close by leaving with some open questions, and I'd like to take questions from all of you. I want to think about what are the tasks, the industries, the occupations that are going to be affected. Michael Osborne is here, who's done some of the most famous and prominent work in that area, very helpful moving that forward. But how much more can we think about going forward in terms of what the second wave can do versus the first wave? What are the implications for business and the economy, for productivity, growth, work and leisure? These things are all going to change and are changing because of the technology. And then what does that mean in terms of the strategies? Not just maximizing the benefits, but also minimizing the risks and the harms. Even some people see existential risks, but certainly there are some big opportunities to take advantage of these technologies to create better health and wealth and well-being for almost everybody. At the end of the day, I think the most important question we have to think about is what kind of society do we ultimately want? We have more powerful tools now than we ever had before. These machines can do things that were never possible before. And if you think about that, that means that more or less by definition, we have more power to change the world than we did before. That was the first question I asked you. We have such powerful tools that means we have more power. That means that our choices make a bigger difference than ever before. We have more ability to change the course of history going forward because of these choices. And that's why I don't want us to be passive. I don't want us to sit back and say, oh, what's going to happen to us? I want us to be active and think, what is it that we want to achieve, and how can we use these powerful tools to achieve those kinds of goals going forward? And that's the ultimate question that we're going to have to ask more and more. So let me wrap up by saying that you can read a lot more about this. This is the new book, and this is the old book. There's a bunch of research for free available at the website there, my own personal website, and also the IDE, Initiative on the Digital Economy website. And we go much more in depth on many of these issues, all these issues, with some research behind it. But let me pause there and thank you all for coming here and hearing about my research. I'm looking forward to your questions and comments. So who would like to start with a question? We've got one right here, maybe? So do we need a microphone or? Yep, good idea.
Yes, thank you for your talk. I've been in computing since 1962. That won't be of much interest to you, but I've attended 2 lectures within the last 18 months, and they've said machine learning's going nowhere. Now, you're talking about it as if it's more or less commodity. So my question to you is, the deep mind people, what magic have they dreamt up that, enables all this to be possible? And is it going to be just widespread available?
Mm-hmm. So who said that machine learning is going nowhere?
2 speakers at lectures I attended here at this location within the last 18 months.
So I think they're wrong. I couldn't disagree more. I'm surprised. I've talked a lot. I've never heard anybody say that. So I got to find out who these people are, and maybe they can educate me. But there's been very rapid. I showed you the data. I mean, for instance, in vision systems, in voice. A lot of those were dated literally just a month or 2 ago of things that were not possible before that are now possible. And if you talk to people, and not just the folks at Google DeepMind, they're doing amazing stuff, but whether it's Microsoft, Facebook has a really good team, Amazon's got an impressive team, Google has a whole other team at Google Brain, and then there's people like the guy with the cucumbers. He was not a star, he was just a guy who pulled some stuff off the web, which gets to your point that you can pull down some of these tools. Thankfully, Google and others have made them available. TensorFlow, go ahead and you can Google it now if you want, and you can download open source software. What you need is tag data. The scarce resource isn't necessarily these algorithms, although I'm glad that people keep pushing the algorithms forward, and that's part of what we have now. Some of the scarce resources are having the tagged data, because the category that works really well is the one I showed you earlier, is what they call supervised learning, where you have examples of this is a dog, this is a cat. And if you show it enough examples, it will recognize them pretty well, not perfectly, possibly not quite as well as a human, possibly a little better than a human. It will make different kinds of errors. I could show you some other slides of really silly errors that some of these make, where they see something that you and I would easily see is not a cat. It has some weird shapes, but it thinks it's a cat. So it can make some crazy mistakes. And that's, you'd want to perhaps have a human in the loop for some of these decisions if it's a mission critical decision. But I want to stress that humans are not perfect either. And I think sometimes people hold up this standard of, hey, the machine made a mistake, so it's not ready for prime time. All of us almost always make a mistake. And so we have to have a standard of can this improve the outcomes compared to before. But I think I'm in a very different place than those other folks in terms of what the progress has been. And the machine learning people I talk to have been pretty impressed. Now, perhaps there's a pushback that there's also a lot of hype, and there's this idea, okay, all the jobs are going to be gone, and machines can do everything. And I hope I didn't say that, because I don't think that's true. There are many tasks that can now be done that weren't previously done. There are many more tasks that only humans can do. This is not the end of all need for humans, or that machines can do everything. That would be an unrealistic and extreme interpretation. And there are certainly barriers that that machines are running into. But I see this as an inflection point where a lot of things are happening faster than people expected 5 years ago. Sure. Sure, right here.
I think it's interesting that you mentioned the inflection point, because to come back to my esteemed colleague over here, I was out at Stanford with Peter Abil, who does the robotics and AI there. And he was also, I think, I wouldn't say he's negative and say it wasn't going anywhere, but he was very critical about the speed of robots and the speed of AI. And I was wondering, coming back to your inflection point, whether actually some of the people in the middle of this, in Stanford, in MIT, are underestimating the exponentiality of some of this. That even the people in the middle of it aren't seeing that these things, just as you said, are going so much more faster every year. And they are also erring on the side of caution.
Yeah.
Could that be possible?
I think it depends a lot on where you set the goalposts. And I think that, for instance, the people with the self-driving cars, I think that they tell me that getting the first 95 or 99% of the way has actually been, in some ways, easier than getting that last 1%, because there's so many weird exceptions that you have to deal with. So driving around in a structured environment, like the Nutonomy car did within, not totally structured, but a constrained environment, like in Singapore, that's a lot easier than having a car just drive out in the wild where you haven't seen things before. And so I think sometimes they're cautious about saying how rapidly we'll be able to get to those other areas. There's other people, the CEO of Mobileye, one of the companies I mentioned, and he was telling me he was pretty confident by 2021 we would have these self-driving cars driving in most different places. I mean, I guess we'll see within 4 years or so. We'll see where they are. I'm thinking this a little bit more from an economist perspective, though, and that is, regardless of exactly where you set the goalposts, the effect on jobs and income are already clear that those they're measurable in the data already. I showed you the data. And going forward, I can't see how they wouldn't be even bigger, because just suppose the technology froze right now. Suppose that Silicon Valley fell into the ocean and the guys at DeepMind decided to sit back and stop working, and we just had no more progress. Just the technologies that we have today if companies started implementing them like the cucumber guy did, we will have so many economic applications that will have a first order effect on GDP, on jobs and work. And that's what makes me excited about this topic, is I don't even need more breakthroughs to be able to see that there's going to be big effects. There probably will be more breakthroughs, but the state of implementation is so far behind the frontier of the technology that we will have a couple of decades just implementing what we already have in place. And that could be millions of jobs. You don't need a perfect self-driving system to have one that would still affect big parts of the economy or any of those different categories. So maybe that's part of the contrast there, is do we have a perfect system, and is that goal attainable? People might be pessimistic about that. Do we have one that's economically important? No doubt in my mind. So let's take another question. Let's go one in the front, and then we'll get some more going back. Yeah, go ahead.
One of your distinguished predecessors on this platform, Nick Bostrom, talked about the possibility of achieving consensuality in his description, a singular world. Now, this has been a marvelous discussion and description of what rationality is doing, but it has left out the blind forces of belief. Half the world doesn't believe in evolution even. Most of the religions don't. And ignorance, which has certainly played its part in various political decisions recently. And I wonder how you do converge your reality and that reality.
Well, I think that's the biggest problem going forward, is that the technology, I think, is in place, remarkable. We aren't implementing it. It's not just a matter of the economic implementation. There's the political and social implementation, and I'm looking forward. My son Luke and I are going to have dinner with Nick tomorrow, so we'll ask him more about that particular question, and I'm looking forward to that discussion because I'm a big fan of the work he's been doing. But that's really, in a way, what motivates me, is I would like to get all of you and everyone else who will listen to be interested in this question. And it's great what the technologies are doing, but we don't need necessarily me exhorting them more. We need me exhorting all of you, and you helping to exhort people, that we need to think about how to be less ignorant about it, more focused, and take these questions seriously, and change our social and economic and political and personal ethical decisions in order to create a better world. I think that this powerful tool, I skipped over this hammer here. You know, hammers can be used in lots of different ways. They can be dangerous. They can be very constructive. They are a tool that gives us power to do things we couldn't do, at least not very easily, without the hammer. And now we have far more powerful tools. They're not, I don't think, necessarily going to drive us towards a really good outcome or a really bad outcome. It will depend on what our choices are going forward. That is the gap. That is the need we need to think about more going forward. Other questions? So let's try and go a little further back. Yeah, great. Let's go. Oh, good. We have another mic. We can do twice as many questions. Go ahead. Yeah. Is there somebody who's? Well, all the way in the back. We'll go all the way in the back. Sure.
So my question is, as machines take over jobs from people get unemployed, and one solution to that would be not to make less people work, but to make people work less on average. And I'm wondering, do you think this will happen, and when will it happen, and how will it happen?
Yes, it is a solution, and as you may know, working hours are a lot less now than they were 100 years ago. The work week used to be at least 6 days a week. Many people work 70 hours a week, and much of it was unpaid labor in the home that also was quite backbreaking, so if in anything it was even more extreme. And so the work week has shortened quite a bit. If I had another version of this talk, I'd show you that that's happening. Going forward, I expect that to happen more. I also just want to nuance the first thing you said in terms of machines replacing all work. Machines are also creating some opportunities, things we couldn't do before. You know, the data scientists who are solving problems in curing diseases that couldn't have been solved before, and people maybe doing other things in interpersonal categories. So there's opportunities both for creation and elimination. But in general, as we become wealthier, I think a lot of us will choose to spend less of our time working and more of our time interacting in social other ways. So the work week is likely to get a lot shorter. John Maynard Keynes wrote a great article that I encourage you to read if you have a moment. It's only about 20 or 30 pages long, no math or equations, back in 1930, called Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren. And he tried to predict what would happen in a future world where we had technology that could do more and more tasks. And to his credit, he was very accurate in predicting the growth rate of the economy, about 2% compounded since the early 1920s, 1930s. So if you compare what he predicted GDP would be to what it actually is, he got it almost exactly right for today, 2017. However, the part that he got seemingly quite wrong was working hours. He predicted they would fall much more rapidly than people who were as wealthy as us would choose to work less. People are working quite a bit, and maybe there's some social barriers that are keeping people working more, or maybe we can buy fancy flat screen TVs or something that he didn't imagine, and we've decided to spend more time working, or maybe there's some kind of a rational mass delusion that's keeping us all working more. It's not quite clear why we work so much more than he would have projected. But that would, if you read that article, I think you'd be interested in see some of the arguments about what's going to happen to the work week. And maybe he's just premature. Maybe over time we'll get down to, he would predict, by the way, about a 12-hour work week, which I think we're pretty far from. Let's go a little, how about the woman right here?
How would you respond to concerns about the bias or prejudice in algorithms? And what would you say about building a different kind of code, one of ethics, and how you would perhaps sort of inculcate the next generation of coders to write future algorithms, keeping
like
in
what?
mind the impact. Pardon?
Next generation systems like what?
Oh, how would you inculcate the next generation of coders?
Okay. Yes. So I'm glad you asked about this. This is one of the hottest and most troubling areas of AI. I mentioned Polanyi's paradox, which is this idea that we know more than we can tell, and we can't explain how the machines are working. Well, there's a reverse of that. I have to come up with the name of it, which is that these deep learning machines know more than they can tell us. They are making decisions, and they can't explain why. Some of them, believe it or not, have up to 1 billion parameters. That's the sort of the state of the art. And so if you were to ask them what they were doing, they would say, well, here's all the equations, and they each have, this one has a value of 0.07, this one's a value of 0.06, and you'd look at it and be like, it's not very helpful to have a list of 1 billion parameters. So they have they reason in ways that they are not able to explain to us. And this is a problem because of the first thing you said there, which is that they often have bias, algorithmic bias. When somebody writes these algorithms to say, one common use is, say, to recommend bank loans. They don't necessarily build in bias. I don't think there's, in most cases, or hardly ever, there's some evil programmer that's saying, let's discriminate. Instead, what happens is it says, here's a bunch of data. Here are all the people we approve for bank loans, and here's all the people we rejected. And then the system learns to approve these people and reject those people. Well, guess what? If the humans were biased, the machine is going to be biased. And maybe in some subtle ways that we don't even realize. And so over time, the machine is going to learn our own prejudice. It's going to reflect all the strengths, but also all the flaws that we have as humans. And in a way, it's scarier because, like I said, you can't explain back. You can't go and ask the machine, hey, were you discriminating on gender or race or whatever? The machine just said, well, here's the parameters. And so that could be a big problem. And as we start turning over more and more of our decisions in credit scoring, who gets parole, who stays in jail, who gets hired, who gets fired, what ad gets shown. LaTanya Sweeney, one of my colleagues at, she's at Harvard. She's African American, and she Googled herself, LaTanya Sweeney, and up next to her face came this ad that said, LaTanya Sweeney arrested, ? And she's like, what's that? I've never been arrested. And it was somebody had served up an ad. Apparently those ads are more common, more likely to be clicked on if they're next to an African American name than next to a white sounding name. And she was understandably quite upset that it was serving up these sort of biased ads. She hadn't been in jail, but people click on those ads for some reason. And so those are the kinds of subtle biases that can be very important. Let me leave you with a note of hope, though, which is that, as I said earlier, I don't think the standard can be perfection. We're going to have imperfect algorithms. We have imperfect people. There are many studies in behavioral economics that judges, they're more likely to convict somebody right before lunch than when they're hungry than after lunch, after they've had a meal. I mean, just a little advice if you're ever in front of a parole judge. And there are many other kinds of biases that we all make in terms of hiring, firing, and other kinds of decisions. So people are flawed. And if we, with the machine, at least there's the potential that we can start seeing patterns and we can go back and try and interrogate it. And a very hot area of research right now, despite what I said about the paradox, is that people are trying to work on making the machines more explainable and have better ways of having the machines explain. It's still not great, but I think we have the potential at least for fixing a machine and taking the bias out of it, and then going forward it won't be biased, or reducing the bias. But this is an area that's going to become more and more important as we shift more decisions there. And if we don't have a way of understanding it, let me give you one more example, is making a medical decision. If it says, hey, surgery is needed, cut this person open now, as a doctor, you'd like to know, why? Are you sure about this? You really want me to cut this person's chest open? And few people would be willing to do that unless the machine was able to have some real explanation of what's going on, not just say, well, I'm right 98% of the time. Okay, so how about over here on this side?
My understanding of the received macroeconomic wisdom is that when technological change is produced, basically the people who develop the new technology don't receive the benefits, and the benefits go to those who can implement and who can deploy. I'm curious about how you think about that in the context of many of the modern technological improvements really being sort of contained within capital, in your capital versus labor, or a small pool of people. And does this have to do with the deprofessionalization of tasks, or really like labor's ownership of the output in a way that perhaps software developers might not be able to reap?
I think those are some of the most important questions for research going forward. I do not know the answer to them. I would like to work on them. I think that going forward, or historically, who the rewards go depends on our institutions and organizations. So we can have intellectual property law that says that you can't make a copy of Facebook, or you can't make a copy of whatever. Or we could have a different law that says, yeah, you can copy that, but not this. And we can have property rights enforced. We could have antitrust laws enforced, and we could have other things that people write. The legal code is enormous, and on top of that, there's a whole bunch of customs and norms, and there's a bunch of institutions. All these things interact in interesting and perhaps unexpected ways that will lead some people to benefit enormously, and some people think very hard how they can take advantage of it, and other people who maybe created a lot of value to not benefit. Going forward, I mean, it's a little bit of a cop-out, but we need to think about how we modify those rules, and we decide, are these the people we want to have rewarded or less so? Part of it, certainly, I'm sure, is that as you encapsulate more knowledge into physical artifacts, you put it into a program, and you allow a machine to execute on that, then it is no longer in a human brain, and then that, at a minimum, creates the potential for vastly more concentration. Human brains are very spread out, like they are in this room. People, if you're in a law firm, each lawyer might know a few clients and certain types of the code, and no one brain, in a human brain, is big enough to know what all the lawyers know. But if you take that knowledge out of the lawyers' brains and you put it into a system, well, now it's possible for one person or one company to own all of that knowledge and expertise. Potentially, the second system is much more concentrated than the first system. The first system is inherently distributed because, we can't become a Borg, but machines can. So that at least opens the door to a much more concentrated outcome. And with economic concentration tends to come political and other kinds of power concentration. So it's something I think we need to worry a lot more about. I'm not aware of anybody who's really analyzed it well any more than what I just described to you off the top of my head there. So, yeah, right next to you. Go ahead.
Do you think there's an effective role for tax policy in mitigating the potentially adverse impact of human labor being displaced by machines?
Well, for sure. I mean, we already have, progressive taxes, we have value-added taxes, we have all sorts of tax decisions. And for instance, we tax labor quite a bit, more than capital. Bill Gates, said, hey, maybe we should be taxing robots instead of humans. These are levers that we have at our disposal. The decision by almost every government to tax labor creates a intended or unintended effect that if you are an entrepreneur and you create a lot of jobs, you have to pay the government more than if you don't create a lot of jobs. Is that the policy? Do we want to penalize people who create employment and not people who don't? I'm not so sure that's the right thing to do. So we may want to change that. We could have more progressive taxation. But getting back to the earlier question, it's really a much more complicated network of choices we make in our society, and each of them has an effect on income distribution. I wouldn't look only at tax policy, after the other forces have been at work. That's one way, but at least in the United States, and I think most countries, the political economy of changing the tax system too much, it's difficult to get those sorts of things, to get redistribution that way. Whereas if you, say, have more widespread public education or healthcare, that often is an easier way to have a more broadly shared prosperity. But, I'm not a political scientist. I think there are all these levers at our disposal. I would probably take the attitude a bit of what a lot of high-tech companies do, which is to do some experimentation. Let's try some different policies and see how they work out. Let's think about tweaking the tax policy, see how much of effect it has on labor supply, on entrepreneurship, on income distribution. Sometimes you don't know until you try it. So I think we have, we have time for a few more questions. How about right up here, Eric?
I'm concerned that in some ways we're still not taking the prospective revolution really seriously.
Not seriously enough, so you got to talk to this guy over here.
Yes. I work, Future of Humanity Institute with Nick Bostrom and company, and we take the concept of superintelligence very seriously.
Right.
You speak of wholesale displacement of human labor being something we don't expect to see in 20 or 30 years.
Yeah.
But when we think about demographics, stability of the social security system, global warming, 20 to 30 years is a relatively short time.
Yep.
So I think that what I would like to see, and I'd be very interested in your comments on the extent to which people are in fact engaging in the appropriate inquiry and conversation here, is engagement with the question of what do we see on the other side of the revolution. In many ways, the questions become simpler. We're beyond the turbulence of trying to struggle to retain jobs in various sectors. You're beyond ordinary tax questions. It's a question of what do we do when there is wholesale transformation forced on us, and the question is, as you asked, what kind of society do we want? Questions like, what are jobs for?
Right. Well, I agree 100% with what you said, and I just want to be clear. I don't think it's an either-or choice. I think we need to ask those questions. We need to have people like you and me and others working on researching that. The distinction I would make is I don't think we are there today, and I don't think we will be for the next decade, and that has implications for policymaking. So should we have a basic income and a universal basic income for everybody right now because there will be no more jobs? I hear many people advocating that, and I think, that is something for Eric and Nick and others to do some research on of a post-job future, and I don't know how many years away you think that is, but I'm very confident it's not the next 5 or 10 years, and implementing it today, I think, would be counterproductive. So let's do the research on, I suspect it would be, I'd like to do the experimentation, maybe I'm wrong, but let's do the research on this world of where the machines are vastly more powerful and intelligent and what the implications are. Let's think about that now because we may have to change our social security system and other things because it takes 30 years for them to implement. But let's also, sometimes I think people get we could call it technological presbyopia. They see these scenarios in the future, which I totally think are very plausible and need attention, and they assume they're going to happen very quickly. And I think that it takes a lot of time for for some of the changes to be implemented. In my book, I talk about the electricity and how it took about 30 years for factories to reconfigure to take advantage of that. You want to add a point to that?
Yeah. I don't think we should confuse the future with the present. I don't think we should confuse future prospects with short-term prospects. But I do think that in looking at short-term prospects and strategies and pathways going forward, we need to think in terms of the aim point. Where are we going? I'm
totally with you. And I think we need to take more seriously what kind of value, what kind of society we want to build towards and be aiming towards that. So I think we're in sync on that. Do we have time for another question or two? One more question. So you want to pick one? Okay. No, okay. How about right over here? You.
Rakesh Rao from Codex. We're an international network of technology CEOs. You mentioned in the second machine age about how humans can race against the machines. And one of the points that you made quite well in the latter chapters was about boosting creativity in schools.
Yes.
So could you give any examples of any country or any educational system where they have significantly managed to boost the creative potential of their kids? For instance, your son is here, Luke is here. Have you been to Luke's school to say, hey, look, sort the curriculum out. I don't want Luke to get Kodak'd in 20 years' time.
Luke, you want to answer that one? I don't think there's any great examples of this. I think that Lexington High School, to put in a plug for it, is a great school and has mostly been and I think that most of the people there do have this idea. There's good teachers and bad teachers, and we were just talking last night. I think that they actually teach too much calculus and not enough statistics, but whatever. We can fine tune that. Mostly, I'm amazed because I was helping with this homework, and I'm like, oh God, you're doing this in high school? I don't understand half of this stuff. So that's impressive, and it's very problem-solving oriented typically. So let me just set that aside for a moment. I've spent some time in Finland, and as you know, they've done very well on many sorts of metrics of it. I think it's easier to think of bad examples, sadly. And the really bad examples is that so much of our education is, I think, almost intentionally designed to drill and hammer out creativity and flexibility and interpersonal skills from people. I mean, they sit people in quiet rows behind desks, and if somebody's doodling or doing something creative, they come over and say, hey, you stop that. Come and write down what we have on the board here and memorize that. And tomorrow we have a quiz where you're going to see how well you've memorized these 10 things. And I want you to follow these instructions. Oh, you skipped number 5 there. So you didn't follow the instructions real carefully. Memorization, following instructions precisely. This is what machines do. This is not what we should be doing. And if you take the typical child, I've had a few. So I see when they're 3 years old and you put a pile of blocks in front of them, what do? Do you have to say, do something creative? No, they just instantly start building, right? You give them a piece of paper and they start drawing. Kids love being creative. Most humans have this innate, passionate, strong desire to be creative. They love connecting with other people. They'll go and play and connect. And it's almost like our schools are designed to stop the creativity, stop the interpersonal skills, stop the play. And if we just sort of stop doing so much damage, maybe I'm kind of optimistic because people love the kinds of things that machines are really bad at. So going forward, half the battle is to stop undoing, just undo the work we're doing. And then going forward, whether it's the Montessori method or at MIT, we're very project-oriented. We've changed our curriculum quite a bit. Aki mentioned that I did create something called the Analytics Lab. It's all project-based, and most of the work at MIT now is very much project-based, getting teams together to try to solve some kind of a problem. I was advising a team working on the Hyperloop, et cetera. And that's more the kind of education, sort of by revealed preference, that I think is what we should be doing. It's what I'm trying to do going forward. And I think more and more schools will eventually get there. But there's just this gigantic gap, and it gets to Erik's question as well, that where the technology is versus what we're doing right now, we are just, we have a lot of work to do to reinvent our educational system, undo the damage we're already doing, and unleash the inherent creativity we have. And let me just close on an optimistic note. I mean, this should be the best thing, and I think it will be the best thing that ever happened to humanity. We're talking about a world with vastly more wealth, with better health, all sorts of environmental problems and other things can be addressed with these amazing technologies. Less need for work, more room for leisure. We can work if we want to. That is what we have in front of us. If we mess this up, shame on us. I mean, shame on us that so many people see this as a bad thing. So many people, I think, legitimately are apprehensive and concerned that this is going to turn out very badly for them personally, because it already has turned out really badly for hundreds of millions of people. It doesn't have to be that way. It totally can and should be a growing pie that allows us to do more creative interpersonal. Isn't it great that what machines like doing, this boring, repetitive stuff, is exactly what we hate doing, and what we love doing is what they're bad at? It's kind of nice the way that worked out. At least most of us love creative interpersonal skills. So I think we should embrace this opportunity, but it's absolutely not going to happen automatically. People often ask me, I'm an optimist or a pessimist. I'm neither. Those are both passive mindsets of what's the technology going to do to us, whether it's good and there's nothing we can do about it, or bad, there's nothing we can do about it. I think we should be active and choose to shape which future we want. Pick an aiming point that we want to go for, decide what our values are, and use these amazing technologies to create the best kind of Earth that we've ever seen before. But it's absolutely not going to happen automatically, and I hope all of you guys will join in trying to take advantage of these technologies to shape it in the direction that we want. Thanks very much.
Erik, 1.5 hours, and what a captivating outlook you've provided. And I've been struck in listening throughout the evening to you that there is something in you that is fascinated by possibility, and yet the refrain that comes throughout your lecture is actually, but all of us need to be actively engaged, because this could go in the right direction or in the wrong direction. Jim Martin, in part in setting up this school here, said, the 21st century could be the worst or the best century in human history. And he, I think, as many others who work on technology, could see the age of possibility. What strikes me, and I want to really pay tribute to you, because I think by trying to explain and allowing a larger part of society to understand what is unfolding, you are creating, and others, the conditions for people to actually have a sense that they have a right to choose. And I think one of the difficulties, and I must admit also whenever I go, whether in Davos to do sessions about technology or here in the university or in public debates, it is a very confusing environment at the moment. Because on the one hand, there are those in deep mind who are saying we're years away from really being able to do anything very significant with AI, for example. And there are others who are saying, and I heard them, CEOs of companies saying, rubbish, we're already using AI and we're using it very successfully. And any of you who try to open a bank account in the UK, just to give one example, are already either survivors or victims of AI at work, because you are being judged maybe originally by something that your bank manager would do, but today you're no longer judged by a bank manager because there is no bank manager to talk to. You are the product, in a business sense, of an algorithm that says you could be of profit to me or not. And that brings me to a point that I think is extremely critical, and perhaps the title of your book, maybe in the second edition, might move from just harnessing the digital revolution to actually managing it, governing it. It comes back to some of the most disturbing graphs of our time at the moment, which are the concentration of wealth, the concentration of wealth amongst very few who have unlocked the ingenious codify, digitalize, and replicate formula. But a society ultimately cannot succeed if these curves continue to go in the direction of the share that labor gets from production and that capital gets. Or indeed, it is not just the notion that repetitive jobs are disappearing. People love going to work. Maybe it is a repetitive job, but it's my place where I socialize, where I belong, where I have an identity. All of this seems to become a victim in the age of technological possibility. And it is that singularity in the debate about the possibility of technology that often seems to err on, because we can do it and because it is so amazing in its potential, most attempts to try and say, yes, but we can choose in where we would like technology to go and where not, de facto becomes an obstruction. And I think you, as many others in this discussion about the future of technology, do need to explicitly put political economy into this. Technology is neither societally neutral nor is it individually neutral. It actually may kill a repetitive job, but most of us are not the people who actually wish they had that job still or in the first place. That's one thing. Secondly, if a society allows through technological possibility and ingenuity to take essentially such a significant share of our commonly produced wealth, not owned wealth, that there is a class of hyper-wealthy people and a class of progressively impoverished people, it causes chaos. And that is part of what we are struggling with right now. And so the work that you do, the work that is happening here at the university, whether it's SNCC or the Institute of Future Humanities and others in computer science, is so critical, because this is not a debate, in my view, that belongs only to tech whiz and technology and computer science gurus, and also not only to those who are clever enough to figure out that here is a brilliant app to get 10 million people to sign up to it within a month. It is actually about choices, and it is one reason why we in the Oxford Martin School this year issued a call that is entitled Digital AI Horizons Normative Frontiers, seeking to trigger and encourage people across, yes, the digital and AI universe, but also the humanities, philosophy, religious science, ethics, legal professions, economists, sociologists, behavioral psychologists, to own this discussion and make it more accessible to society, because it is still a debate that is immensely disempowering for 99% of people. And I think even the business world in this field is sensing this, because there must be a reason why some of the big tech companies last October, I think it was, decided to themselves set up a non-profit on AI, because they're precisely sensing the lack of governance, the lack of public debate, and perhaps the lack of intelligent regulatory or governance mechanisms that are not Luddite, because that cannot be the juxtaposition. Are you for or against the technology? It is more a discussion about what would we like this technology to be part of, which is our society, rather than our society being defined by technology. And I think this is one of the great, really civilizational questions that you are on the front lines of addressing through your work, and hopefully many, many others across many countries and communities will do. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for being part of a conversation that I think you all sense is fundamental to what happens next. And to you, Erik, in particular, thank you for coming to Oxford, for being part of this conversation here this evening, and for your work in the future. All the best. Thank you and good night.